Hello, and welcome to the Petrov Opening. The Petrov starts after e4, e5, white plays the usual move, knight f3, and then the Petrov here is, rather than playing the traditional move knight to c6, you play knight to f6. Now, I've been learning the Petrov as a weapon as black to play mostly against higher rated players, and the idea being that you want to try and get equal lines, trade off the pieces, and have a really simple position to try and play. You're not pressing for an advantage in a lot of these lines, although we'll see you can get an advantage in some of them. You're just trying to nullify what your opponent is throwing at you. So like I say, I use this mostly against higher rated players. So let's start with one thing that if you're playing the Petrov, you absolutely must know. This is probably the critical takeaway. So in most of the lines, white's going to take on e5, and when we take back on e4, this is a disaster, and this is something we want to avoid. So the main takeaway is you want to be taking back on e4, but at the right moment. So here you can see that the queen comes to e2, traditional moves, or you might move your knight away back to f6, and now you can see you're in real trouble. Knight to c6 uncovers a check on the king, as well as attacking our queen, and there's no good way to defend it. Best you can probably do is defend there, and bang, your queen is off. So absolutely critical when they take, don't rush to take this pawn back. So what happens in the kind of main line, to give you an idea of if the best moves are played by both sides, what does that look like? So white does take the pawn on e5 most of the time, and black's response, rather than taking the pawn back immediately, is to insert the move d6 first. So we play d6 to kick the knight away, and now you're safe to take the pawn back. And now we'll have a look at a lot of the main moves that white can play here. We'll look at d4, knight c3, queen e2, and d3. So we'll start off with the main line of d4. Our response here is to kind of match them in the centre, d5. And you can already see here we've got a symmetrical pawn structure. We've actually got a more developed knight in a more attacking position than white. So far, so good. Most played here is bishop d3, and then I like the move bishop to e7 as our response to black. If they want to take the knight, we're more than happy to do that. We'll get an advanced pawn, puts pressure on the knight, and allows us to get a quick castles in. But most of the time, your opponent is going to castle. Now, black usually has two options here. The main one played in the database is castles, but I like the move knight to c6. I think this gives better opportunities for black to equalise, and in one of the lines to push it for an advantage. So I think the best move here for white is c4. This is the most challenging, but we can meet c4 now with b4. So they don't have this c3 push to try and kick our knight away, and we're in attacking this bishop. They drop their bishop back to e2, and now we can go ahead and castle, now that there's no pressure on the knight. White will usually develop now with knight to c3, and then we can get our final piece, minor piece that's not joined the action yet, with our bishop out to f5. Now just kind of following the sample line here of what's the most played move from white, we get a3, we get this trade in, which forces our knight back. They trade here and push forward with c4. So we're up against the d and c4 pawn, so I think this is the most challenging line for white to face. But I'll just show you a sample continuation of how you can kind of get out of this in an even enough position. So queen can drop back, and if they push us again, we throw our knight forward. And if they attack our bishop, we drop it back to d7. So there's ways for black to counter this. We've kind of achieved what we wanted out of the opening of equal material, options to kind of start to destroying black's centre with c6 coming at points in the future, and we've kept a bishop pair and got through the opening unscathed. Now if I go back a few moves to when we brought our knight out, we looked at c4, which I think is the most challenging line from white. The second most played move here is rook e1, and this leads, I think, to a more favourable position for black. So after rook e1, you can put your bishop out on g4, starting to create a pin here against the queen and put some pressure on the d4 pawn. They'll often take the knight is the most played move by white when we take back, and you can see here again the most played move by white is to take that pawn on e4. So we can start to dissolve again some more material on the board by taking the knight on f3, and there's probably two moves here played by white. The most common is queen takes, but we're also going to look at g takes such that they can try and hold on to this pawn, which leads to a really exciting set of moves. So most common move is queen takes, and here we're fine to just take with the knight. according to the engine, we've got a slightly favourable position. We've definitely equalised. We're going to be able to castle. White still hasn't developed the pieces over in the corner, and they've got some back rank problems. So we've done again what we set out to do in the opening. So what happens if white gets greedy and they take the G pawn? Well, now we can really have some fun with this position as black. Starting with the move F5 to put pressure on this rook. So, and the reason they took with the G pawn is they really want to hang on to this pawn. So you can see the most played move in the database, rook F4, again trying to hold on to it. And now we can just launch our G pawn forward, attacking the rook. It gambits the second pawn, so they take us on F5, but the rook is really kind of stranded in no man's land, and we get some nice tempo moves against it now. So we start with Queen D7, and now the rook really doesn't have many great options. I'll just follow a kind of sample line here, but you can see from the engine evaluation we're already at a -2 position. So rook goes out to B7. We can win one of those pawns back by taking on D4. The rook might get greedy again because it's being attacked and gobble our B7 pawn. And here we can actually castle long, attack the rook. We're also planning a quite nasty kingside attack over here with our queen and our knight. So just a sample kind of finish here. They might take on A7. Now we can throw our queen over, like I say, launching this attack. Some of the best moves here could be getting your knight out, putting our bishop into the attack to attack this pawn. They try and defend it by pushing that forward, which gets taken. Throwing their knight back, but that allows us then to throw our knight in with check, and really the best they can hope for here is to take it off, pick up the queen, and mate will soon follow. You're at a -6 position. So if white gets greedy in this line, there's ways for blacks to punish it and get an advantage. So I'm saying the best that white can do with best play is an equal position, but if you know this better than white, you're quite likely going to get into a position that's more favourable for black. So let's look at some of the other options here. So rather than taking on E4, E5, sorry, one of the other plays they can play is playing the knight out to C3. So what do we do against this? I like putting my bishop out to B4 because, again, there's lots of ways that white can go wrong if they don't know what they're doing here. And 3 main moves that white can play against this. They can take the pawn on E5, play D3, or they can bring their bishop out to C4. So the most played in the database is D3, and we follow this up by striking in the centre D5. And again, we'll follow the most played moves, so 72% of the time they're going to take this with their e-pawn, and we can take back with our knight. And now it's starting to put some pressure on their position. So bishop D2 to try and get themselves out of the pin. We can castle here. If knight takes, we take there, queen takes, and we've had a mass trade. We've got our good central control and no real issues with our position in this line. So there. So that looked at D3. The next common move is bishop out to C4, and again we can take that knight, play D6, and just a sample continuation here. Bishop comes out to G5. We can defend it with our knight, castles, kick the bishop away. And you can see here we've got a pretty stable position, not a lot going on for white in this line, and an advantage according to the engine for black. And then the final move is what happens if knight takes on E5. Well, we can castle first, and white can get themselves into trouble with this line. So D3, the most played move, D5 again. So it's all similar kind of themes of the moves that you play here. But D5 is what you want to go for. And then if they take this, they're now in a lot of trouble. Because if knight takes, you're threatening to take the knight, and when they take back, forking the king and the rook. So often they'll block with the bishop. We can eliminate that knight, and then play rook e8 with this devastating pin against the knight. The only way is to defend it with one of the pawns, and you simply push f6 to win it. So that's the knight c3 line. One of the other main options, if we go back to the start, so this is the Petrov classified when black plays knight to f6. So if they go in for this main line, we've looked at what happens if they play d4. One of the options they can go for knight c3, and then another one being queen e2. So against queen e2, you can get a pretty straightforward position here with no stress. Queen e7 is most played, followed by d3, we can drop our knight back. They often try and pin us, but we can get out of this now by just trading the queens, putting our bishop on e7, and saying, look, we've got a super symmetrical position. There's nothing really in this for white at all. So what's one of the other lines? Again, we'll go through to the main position, taking back here. The next option we'll look at is d3. So it's very similar to the main d4 position, but they want our knight kicked back. So our knight comes back to c6, and then often they'll then push d4. So it's very similar to what the main line position is, but we've got a knight on f6, whereas in the first line that we looked at, we had a knight on e4. So how does this continue? Well, bishop sometimes comes out. We can pin their knight. After castles, we can develop our bishop, and they can try and kick us away, and we come back on that diagonal. But again, there's not anything in this position for white. We've managed to liquidate some of the material off. Got a very fine position that's able to be played just fine. So now we go into one of the more dubious lines from white. So after this, usually where they're expecting knight to c6, they'll play bishop out to c4, and they think they can get away with playing it in this position as well. But so as early as move 3, you can see the evaluation, we've got an advantage for black. So how do we capitalise on this? We take the pawn on e4, which might look quite scary because white's able to take back on the e5 pawn and put some pressure on f7. However, we can strike back in the middle with d5, defending our knight and importantly kicking away that bishop. Often the bishop will go back to b3, and now this really important move, queen to g5, double attacking the knight on e5 and also the pawn on g2. So if you look in the database, actually the most played move is castles, which just gives up the knight in the middle, and there's no good way for them to try and get counterattack through here. You might think you've got your queen and your king lined up. There's ways of putting some pressure on. So even if they play d3, the most played move here, what you can do, and one thing to remember, is knight takes on f2. So if we'd moved our knight away, we'd be in trouble because the rook would pin our queen. That's not good. But you have this move, knight takes knight takes f2. Most commonly, the rook's going to take back, and you can see it's -3 here because after bishop to c5, pinning the rook, it's in all kinds of trouble and a really good position for black. And if they play d4, again you can just take on g2, just snap that off the board. And then the most played move here is rook over to f1, but that allows bishop h3, so we're now double attacking the rook. Most common move, queen e2 to try and defend against it. Now you can just simply take the rook, trade it off and go up and exchange. However, the engine likes just playing c6 first to say, I'm not in any rush to take this rook, I can do it in my own time. There's nothing you can do to prevent me taking this exchange at my own time, and I'm stopping you from taking on d5 in any future lines. So one of the final lines we're going to have a look at, starting off with the main position. What happens if white plays d4? So against this, we want to do knight takes on e4. And then again, there's a couple of options for what white can go into here. So we'll look at d takes on e5, we'll look at bishop d3, and we'll also look at knight takes. They're the 3 most played moves in the database. So starting off, d takes e5, we can push our bishop out to c5 and put pressure on the f2 pawn. The most common move here is bishop e3, which when you take this off, you can see you've got quite a favourable position here. For black, we've managed to double white's isolated pawns on the e-file, got equal material, and they're in position to castle in no time. So after our bishops come out to c5, there's again a couple of options for white to play here. Bishop e3 is the main one that we've looked at. The other most played is knight into d4, and this starts getting exciting now. Knight takes on f2, you've got here, because after king takes, queen up to h4, check, g3 is most played, and then you get to trade this knight off. And you can see how this is going to be favourable for black. So that's knight d4, and then a kind of crazy line we get after bishop to c4. We're able to take on f2, and again there's a couple of lines here. The less critical is what happens after queen d5. We're able to put our queen there. rook f1 is most often played, but we're able to now counter strike c6, and after the queen goes back to d2 to play d5, and we're kicking the bishop away. Bishop retreats, we retreat our knight out, and we've got a favourable position here. We've managed to pinch one of white's pawns, and we've got a better position with them unable to castle on the king's side. So rather than playing the queen to d5, the critical line is bishop takes f7, which is absolutely nuts, because after king takes, the queen can come in, and the best square for the king to go up to is up to g6, such that they can take our bishop on c5, but they lose their rook on h1. And if you stop to count the material here, you'll see we're up a rook, but the engine gives it as equal because you've got a king on g6. So, and in practice, white wins 45% of the time, black wins 45% of the time. So it's in practice, it's a pretty even position to play. Otherwise, black, you are up a rook. So this is kind of a crazy option that you're going to. So yeah, thanks for watching what you're likely to cover in the Petrov. I use it as a fighting way against high rated opponents when I've got the black pieces. And there are some ways that white can go wrong and I can gain an early advantage. Thanks for watching.